It's been a long time since wars were conducted, of course, by national armed forces alone. Conflicts are increasingly taking place within borders rather than between nations and are protracted and asymmetrical. And the delivery of humanitarian services has become complicated by a proliferation of actors, not only humanitarian actors, but by the fact that non-humanitarian organisations are increasingly also providing and delivering aid. Roles are increasingly blurred. So armed forces are delivering humanitarian assistance. This complicates the work of NGOs and international organisations like the Red Cross, but at worst it also makes them more vulnerable to attack. Now, we all have an interest in understanding how these agencies can work to improve the situation of vulnerable people and vulnerable communities. And this is well after the conference is no longer grabbing the headlines. After all, what happens in these conflicts does actually affect us all, whether we're private donors to humanitarian assistance or through our governments that funds agencies to provide humanitarian assistance, or perhaps the greatest sacrifice of all, sending our armed forces to these conflict zones to establish peace and to sustain it. As the world's oldest private international humanitarian organisation, and I would say probably the most widely recognised humanitarian organisation, the International Committee of the Red Cross can offer some particular insights into these vexed questions. And there is no one better qualified, I would say, than ICRC's Director of Operations, Pierre Krähenbühl, who is our speaker today. He has considerable field experience in Afghanistan, Peru, El Salvador, Bosnia and Herzegovina. He became Director of Operations of the ICRC in 2002, and he oversees the activities of some 12,000 ICRC staff in 80 organisations. Before asking you to welcome Pierre Krähenbühl, can I also invite you all to turn off your mobile phones or turn them to silent so we can enjoy the speaker and participate in a Q&A session at the end. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Pierre Krähenbühl.
Well, thank you, first of all, Martin, for the very warm words of welcome and for the invitation to speak today here at the Lowy Institute. We're very privileged to enjoy a long-standing relationship with you personally, but also here with the Institute since its foundation. We take great pride in that. And I'd like to begin by saying that the visit here that I'm engaged in Australia is part of a regular set of visits that I carry out to different countries across the world in the objective to strengthen relations, and the relations that the ICRC enjoys with Australia are rich and very rewarding in many ways. It is a country that has supported the ICRC strongly over the years, takes great interest in the humanitarian issues that we are involved in, has been a keen supporter of the ICRC's work, both diplomatically and financially, but also in supporting developments and debates around international humanitarian law, which is the law that applies in situations of armed conflict. So we feel very proud about that part of the relation. Also a long-standing relationship with the Australian Red Cross, a keen contributor and partner in many operations internationally for the ICRC. I'm also keenly conscious of the fact that I am arriving in Australia at a time where the country is just facing daunting consequences of a series of natural disasters, and listening to the descriptions by my colleagues, but also reading about it and following it over the media. Of course, also very conscious of the important response at community level, the incredible generosity of Australians, and I think it's a symbol for what humanitarian action often stands for. Long before an international response takes place, it is in fact neighbours that mobilize, it's community work, and through that it's also an opportunity to acknowledge the work and contribution of our colleagues in the Australian Red Cross at times of particular need in your own country. Now, the things I'd like to address today in the outline of this presentation really touch upon several of the points that Martin was alluding to, which was that on the one hand, I'll look at some of the main trends that characterize today's situations of armed conflict and other situations of violence that the ICRC operates in worldwide. I'd also like to look at a number of issues that affect changes in the humanitarian community the way in which the humanitarian organizations work and how the world around us is affecting changes in that regard. Also to describe to you some of the challenges that the ICRC more directly faces in carrying out our work worldwide, and give you a sense in particular of how issues like the militarization of aid is affecting that working environment. And then I'll be particularly pleased to engage in a discussion with you. I think I'd like to begin by looking at some of the overall trends, and I'm looking at them from the perspective of an organization like the ICRC and related to situations of armed conflict and violence. And I think one of the first things that comes to mind when we look at the majority of armed conflict situations that we operate in today is that we operate in environments that are characterized far less than they were, for instance, during the Cold War, by ideological confrontations. In other words, the political environments that we operate in are marked by other features than this very strong framework of reference that existed during the Cold War, where many of the conflicts were influenced by matters related to the ideological confrontation between East and West, but also the dynamics of post-colonial rule, the national liberation movements during the 1960s, 70s, into the 80s, all conflict environments that were strongly characterized and related to that set of political grievances. Now today, the majority of contexts that we operate in are in fact characterized much more by conflict dynamics that are related to resource-related factors. It is the attempt to control vast, whether they are mineral or other resources existing around the world. I think here, for instance, of a conflict that is very much characterized by that, which is the situation in the Democratic Republic of Congo, with the vast mineral deposits, for instance, in eastern DRC that generate, of course, attract a great deal of attention, but also generate much of the fragmentation of that conflict, because the interest for many of the groups is in fact control over these vast mineral resources. And in fact, in those dynamics, it is less about confrontation against other groups, but rather control over the vast mineral resources. And these generate dynamics of prolonged conflict that are very difficult to manage over time and have very significant impact for the populations that are affected. Of course, in a number of contexts, we also have strongly tribal or community-based confrontations. These exist in different parts of the world. Of course, Africa comes to mind, but in very different ways, we've also seen forms of conflict or violence. Last year, I gave you the example of a new operation for the ICRC, which was our response to the intercommunal violence in Kyrgyzstan that took place last year. And is, of course, also a matter of our focus in working here in the Asia-Pacific region, where we look at potential examples and situations of tribal confrontations, tribal clashes, intercommunal violence, and the work we carry out with the Red Cross societies in those contexts. One of the features that I think is very important to have in mind when looking at armed conflicts today is that much of the humanitarian community, but also the development sector, has focused over the past 50 years very much on rural-based responses. However, more and more of the conflicts and forms of violence that we face today are becoming urban-based. And this is, of course, a result of many of the migration flows, the dynamics of people moving to the big urban centers of our world. We've seen the statistics. The majority of people today live in urban centers, and we realize that in different ways than in rural environments, parts of those urban centers also become difficult to contain in security terms, difficult to manage, and then become other regions of potential violence, be they organized, gang-based, or political, and therefore potentially more open armed conflicts also in urban centers. And I think one has to have in mind that developing humanitarian responses in urban centers or heavily urbanized environments is a very different approach than the traditional rural-based. Thinking about livelihood, for instance, in Darfur or in Somalia, you can deal with, for instance, cattle vaccination programs, which is a way of preserving the capital of a given family, and to avoid simply the dependency debate that results very often from humanitarian action. Well, what is the livelihood response in an urban environment? Very different in terms of the approaches one may take. We've also realized that in a number of contexts where we work, you have overlapping layers of pressures. And what I mean by that is that a same population may be affected by armed conflict, but also exposed to severe consequences of natural disasters and of environmental degradation. One region that is very much characterized by this currently is the Sahel region, in, for instance, northern Niger or northern Mali in Africa, where you have a combination of intercommunal insurgency confrontations, but also population movements as a result of changes in the climate and environmental degradation that again will lead to bigger concentrations of populations for limited resources available, and therefore potentially leading to new forms of violence between communities. Somalia is another example where the ICRC works in response to conflict. Of course, we have people wounded, supported in hospitals, we have displaced people as a result of the fighting, but we also have a number of people who are displaced every year as a result of drought or flooding, or sometimes both, in the same region during the year. And so, of course, it becomes very difficult to distinguish between the different beneficiary populations that one has in those kinds of contexts. The global health hazards are, of course, also impacting in that sense, whether it's malaria, tuberculosis, or HIV/AIDS, affecting populations, again, caught up at the same time by armed conflict dynamics. Now, I think for me, the one important point that I really would like to emphasize is when I look at the operations that the ICRC carries out currently, and if I look at the armed conflicts that we work in, it is really, first of all, the diversity of situations that we deal with. And this may sound fairly basic and straightforward, but it really has a number of implications. We deal, in some instances, with some of the most technologically advanced armed forces in the world. Say, in the Afghan conflict, of course, with the US deployment, the International Security Assistance Force that are there under international response, some of the most advanced means in the military sense, all the way down to the most rudimentary forms of confrontation and violence, and that have a very different impact on populations. So for an organization to deal with these changes of forms of armed conflict, to understand the impact that they have on the populations affected, is very important. It was already mentioned earlier that the majority of armed conflicts today are, of course, internal. We had, for a long time, a predominant form that were the conflicts between states. Today, this is very, very rare. In fact, we had only very few over the past decade. And that in itself entails a number of challenges related also at times to national sovereignty and other perception-related issues. The other factor that is very important when we look at armed conflicts today is the notion of the average duration of armed conflicts. A very important theme as far as I'm concerned, because I think in most people's mind when we think about an armed conflict, we think about something that is, there's a peak moment of a crisis. So for instance, I'm often confronted with questions around the conflict in Gaza in the early 2009, the so-called cast-lead operations by the Israeli Defense Forces. And that particular confrontation was a 3-week period, and I'm confronted with questions around, well, that was the emergency phase of the conflict. But the ICRC has been present for 40 years in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. And that is, of course, when you look at 40 years of presence, 40 years of ongoing conflict, that is a big challenge in how to respond to such prolonged forms of conflict. Afghanistan is a 30-year uninterrupted presence for the ICRC. Iraq, it's again 30 years. Colombia, 40 years. And the OECD's definition of a humanitarian crisis is a 6-month emergency phase. So of course, when one looks at 6 months or if one looks at 40 years of uninterrupted presence, it is a very different issue and a very different matter. So I think the idea that one often comes with is that humanitarian response is an emergency response is only part of the story. When you're present for 40 years, it has very different implications. And I realize that raises questions about why is that so? Why do armed conflicts tend to last so long currently? Well, the first thing is we've seen that they are very rarely actually ended in outright military terms. There are few decisive victories on the battlefields of today. They're actually rather protracted, where one side gains a bit, then loses again, pushes, pulls back, and they tend to last for those reasons, but they also tend to last because they are very rarely resolved politically. And I think this is an issue in today's world where, again, during the 1980s or 1970s, if you were in Geneva, where we have our headquarters, you regularly saw delegations arriving at the UN headquarters in Geneva to negotiate resolutions of armed conflicts. It was during the Afghanistan conflict or the Iran-Iraq war. You'd have delegations coming to the UN as the natural go-between when negotiating settlements between states. Today, the vast majority of conflicts are between state and non-state actors. And my sense is that there is a lack today in the international system of a legitimized go-between to talk and attempt to resolve conflicts that take place between state and non-state actors. So this brings us to the nature of actors in armed conflicts, and I think I've just mentioned that we deal with the state and non-state world very much. We deal in particular with a very big diversity of non-state actors. Coming back to my earlier example of the conflicts during the Cold War or during the phase of national liberation movements, working in Latin America, you would typically have a government opposed to 2 or 3 very politically organized opposition groups, and you would know who was the political leader of that group, who was in charge of the military chain of command. Things were fairly structured and organized. In today's armed conflicts, we deal sometimes with our colleagues currently in the Democratic Republic of Congo with 40 different armed factions. In the east of the DRC, you can count similar dynamics in parts, no longer today, but a few years ago in the Darfur context, Somalia, even Afghanistan, which is currently affected by considerable fragmentation in the conflict. So for the populations, that means a great deal of uncertainty and unpredictability in what is happening around them. For humanitarian organizations like the ICRC, it means a huge amount of work carried out to try and understand who is who and to be in dialogue with all of those groups, a feature of our work that I will return to later. Increasingly also, we realize that there is a mix in the actors that we deal with in many of the contexts because it is related so strongly to the resource link. We have a mix of motivations between political and outright criminal. So you may, during a field visit or during a week that you work in a given region, be confronted with a group that is describing to you its political motivations, but you also have the outright criminal component in these very destabilizing operating environments that we are present in. And that, I think, explains this tendency to fragment. You have countries where a given group will be approached to be part of a national reconciliation process, but at the same time it is in control of a gold mine. Now, if you're in control of a gold mine, the incentive to join the political discussions at a national level are, of course, not very high, because you think you're unlikely to get the same level of status and recognition that you have because of this access to the vast mineral resources that you're controlling, that you would have as being a member of the local parliament or of integrating the national armed forces. And so the tendency is that you observe strong fragmentation that explains why we deal with so many groups at the level of the conflicts that we operate in. And I'd like to turn here to the impact this has on populations. Of course, I think everybody who thinks about armed conflicts will have in mind a number of the most immediate needs that populations face. It is, of course, the direct consequences of armed conflict. Somebody is injured. You face life-threatening situations as a result of the armed violence in the communities that you work in. You also have situations of people detained and the concern about ill treatment or torture in places of detention. You have situations of people with immediate survival needs, the physical needs, water-related, food-related. Those, I think, are the issues that come most naturally to mind when you think of situations of armed conflict. But remember the link I was establishing earlier about the duration of armed conflict. When you have a conflict going on for 30 years, well, the question isn't only about, it is certainly strongly about the survival and the immediate physical needs, but there are also many indirect consequences of armed conflict. So for instance, I'll take an example from Afghanistan. The ICRC supports the main hospital in Kandahar, for instance, in the southeast, where we would have traditionally supported the war surgery department, because that's what we're about historically. It's about providing life-saving surgery, conflict-related injuries, and addressing those. But we realized that if we did only that part in today's world, we would be looking only at part of the consequences of the conflict, whereas the official figures in Afghanistan are still that 1,600 women die in child delivery out of 100,000 live births every year. And so and those are not, of course, consequences directly or exclusively related to the conflict dynamics. It's also the difficulty of receiving and establishing sufficient direct health care in the communities and others. But it's also because, in many instances, women don't have a health center to go to or a hospital that they can easily access because of the conflict dynamics. So they might not be a direct victim of the conflict, but it is very important that we look at a wider set of responses when thinking about the impacts of conflict on populations. Then there is the issue of the traditional focus of the humanitarian sector on the physical needs of populations and the relative, if not larger, neglect of the psychological consequences of war. The tendency has been to say one deals with that when the war is over. Well, I'm not sure that was ever a very good argument, but certainly it's not a very convincing one when one looks at the average duration of conflicts. Again, if your country is affected by 2, 3, or 4 decades of warfare, the fact is you have multiple psychological consequences that affect an entire country. And if we are not looking at some of those consequences more seriously, then I think we are taking a too restrictive view of what humanitarian action is about today. I can give you a set of examples that come to mind. One deals with a very sensitive issue that we often find, certainly at the end of conflicts, but throughout a conflict, which is the issue of missing persons. We have in Iraq several hundreds of thousands of widows, for instance, and women who are heading households, who are, most of them, still uncertain about the fate of their husbands that have gone lost and missing during the many phases and the different phases of the conflict in Iraq. That weighs incredibly heavily on the future of that country, in addition to other challenges it has, the same in the Balkans environment or in other contexts. We have it also, the consequences in psychological terms of widespread sexual violence in countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, but also in Colombia and elsewhere, where we need to address the consequences not only from the physical perspective, but also from the psychological impact that it has on victims of such aggressions. Now, turning to the evolution of the humanitarian sector, just say a couple of words there, because I think we all have views and there are organizations that come to mind naturally when we think of humanitarian response, certainly many agencies within the UN system, UNHCR, UNICEF, WFP and others, Doctors Without Borders, the Oxfam and Save the Children family, the wider Red Cross and Red Crescent family, including the ICRC. I think the one thing to have in mind is that this is a sector that is going through important changes. One set of parameters is related to, of course, the perception around the humanitarian sector's impact and efficiency. Two big natural disasters last year, Haiti and the Pakistan floods, will be much debated in months to come still in terms of the impact that the humanitarian response had in either saving lives or in addressing needs of the affected populations appropriately and adequately. We also have important security challenges that I would return to briefly. But I also look at it from the perspective of the new information technologies, which is something that is going to change the operating environment for many humanitarian organizations. We saw that in several contexts last year where the populations affected are starting to communicate directly with the populations and civil society in, I presume, here in Australia, certainly also in the US and in part of the rest of the world. In fact, the communication through the social networks, be it through Facebook or Twitter or others, populations affected by a natural disaster such as in Haiti did not wait for the humanitarian agencies to carry out a 3-week survey of their needs. They started communicating over Facebook and Twitter within minutes of the disaster to put their own assessment of their own needs forward, something which is going to challenge the traditional sort of go-between role that humanitarian agencies felt they've had for many years, in fact. In that sense, we feel the humanitarian environment, whether it's a sector or community or however we want to call it, is going to change very considerably. And not least also because of the changes that we observe in the world in political terms. It is clear that the new political landscape that is emerging in the beginning of this century, with the rise of a number of countries from China to India, of course South Africa, Brazil, and elsewhere, is of course also over the next decade going to have a very significant impact on what types of humanitarian responses take place, what organizations these countries will support, or whether they will deploy their own responses increasingly. These questions are going to be very significant for the future work. Now, you know the ICRC well because we have a long history, but I think it's just worth taking a couple of very brief reminders. We are an organization that was literally born on the battlefield when our founder came across a very dramatic situation on the battlefields of Solferino 150 years ago, and decided both first to respond and then that it was necessary to develop a certain number of frameworks that would limit the effects of armed conflict. In other words, what was at the origin of the whole dynamic that led to the Geneva Conventions and to the efforts also in legal terms to contain the effects of armed conflict. And this remains at the center of the ICRC's identity. When we work in the field, we look to respond to needs concretely, but we also continue to seek developments and new ideas in the reach of international humanitarian law. And the other parameter that I think is very specific to how the ICRC was mandated to work is that we do talk to all the parties in an armed conflict. So in Afghanistan, we have extensive dialogue with US armed forces and ISAF on detention-related matters, on conduct of hostilities and how military operations affect civilians. But we also have those discussions with the armed opposition and the Taliban, with whom we raise important issues in that regard as well. That is how we have been mandated to work, and we have that dialogue in different countries across the world. Here's just a very brief overview of what our 10 largest operations are, in which countries they are. And I highlight these simply because it's important for me to describe that this year we're putting forward the single largest ICRC field budget to our donors that we've ever presented. And one could ask, well, considering that last year, for example, was characterized mainly by natural disasters, why would the ICRC have this year its single largest budget? Well, to the credit of many of our field teams, we've actually been able to add access, to improve access to affected communities in most of the countries that are listed here. And therefore, for us, it is very important that these situations of armed conflict figure at the very center of our identity. But I do want to highlight that in addition to these more classic armed conflicts, the ICRC is increasingly investing also in what we call other situations of violence. Those are situations that don't amount to a full-fledged armed conflict, but that may entail situations of state repression, intercommunal violence, or increasingly the phenomenon of violence in urban settings. These are, we believe, important future challenges for both in political terms and in humanitarian terms. This is just, you're all very familiar with the Afghanistan environment. I'm just highlighting here the number of places, and you see it just indicated with the red crosses around, that the ICRC now has physical presence in Afghanistan. This is the result of many years of efforts. So it is not only in the capital, Kabul, but all around the country, which is also an indication of how the conflict dynamics have spread and how important the needs are in the different regions of Afghanistan. I'm happy to come back to this context in the discussion later. So what is a very important feature in our work is, of course, the efforts that the ICRC engages in to obtain direct access to populations. We believe that our credibility is related to the ability to reach populations where they are, to be in direct contact, first of all, but also to be able to approach them with our responses directly, not through intermediaries. This is a lot of work. When I described earlier to have contacts with 40 different groups in the Democratic Republic of Congo, that means a day-to-day effort by our field staff on the ground to travel through the communities, the villages, also to make sure that our assistance doesn't become the next security risk for the population, because when humanitarian agencies distribute assistance, that may be just, the attraction for armed groups. And there are very many countries where when you distribute assistance, that may become a factor of violence for the population if you don't pay close attention to how you distribute and when.